Okay, well, this last session, not a final rally, but I do think that having a session, closing session on climate change is fitting, because other than the threat of sort of generalized nuclear exchange, I don't think that we face a bigger challenge as a species. I mean, it's feasible to imagine some sort of pandemic, a new pandemic that kills off, something of the proportions of the Black Death in Europe. I don't want to end, by the way. I'm not trying to end with everyone going, "Oh my God, this is." But this is clearly the issue of the moment. And really, what I wanted to do to begin with is really to say that compared with, say, 20 or 30 years ago, this is no longer a debate, right? This is now, in terms of, serious business. Here's the problem. And then the debate is about what we do about it. So if you look at the shift that's occurred, I mean, you used to, when the word climate change was mentioned on the unbiased BBC, you used to get a situation where the editors would demand someone coming in who was called a climate skeptic, which you could, if you wanted to use other language, climate change denier. None of that's fair on that basis, but in essence, what they were saying is that this is weather. This isn't the climate. In other words, it wasn't human beings that were doing anything. This was some sort of natural occurrence that could be explained. So we had all the stuff about volcanoes, all of which is relevant. None of that's irrelevant. Stuff about, I don't know, planetary wobbles and cycles, and all of that, of course, needs to be investigated. But I think that's over now. And I think that the computer models, the science has gone from being good to being exceptional now. And I think that's been the change. And also, in terms of public opinion, I think the school that says it's nothing but weather, I think I heard, some Tory MP a month ago just saying, well, this is summer. Well, in Britain, actually, it's been bloody miserable. So, well, maybe, but if we look at things on a global scale with the technology we now have, it's clear that this isn't just shrug of shoulders, this is summer. What we're dealing with, and it's been remarkable, hasn't it, over just the last short period, is one horrendous statistic after the other. I mean, almost not a week went by without a record being broken. And we're not talking, of course, about London or Britain. We're talking globally. And so we are told, and I have no reason to doubt it, that July, last month, was the hottest July on record. Now, of course, if you go back to the fossil record, then but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in history, and we're talking about records that reasonably reliably, go back maybe 100, maybe 150 years. Nonetheless, the point would be here that we're not just dealing with records being broken. We're actually talking about a particular trajectory, a particular course. So if we look at the reported increase in global average temperatures, what we're told is that compared with pre-industrial times, maybe temperatures have risen, say, 0.9 degrees centigrade, something along those lines. But most of that change has happened in the last 40 years. And that's what's worrying. And so therefore, if you think back to Paris 2015, when they were making these pledges, these commitments to keep global temperature rises below 0.5 degrees centigrade. It's quite conceivable that this year, next year, maybe the year after, they actually hit that. Now, that doesn't make that the norm. Doesn't mean that you're there, but it does mean that it's on course to become the norm. Now, I don't know, and if someone here does, pipe up, I don't know whether 1.5 is a particular tipping point, or maybe it's a whole series of tipping points. But what we know is that temperature, weather, the climate does have tipping points. Of that, there's no doubt. And how, when you reach it, I don't know. But what you can go into is a situation where at the moment we sort of have the Gulf Stream, we have particular currents in the air, we have Britain having a moderate but pleasant temperature compared with Labrador and all the rest of it that we're used to at the moment. And you can suddenly trigger in to a different global climate pattern. But even where we are now, all one needs to do, almost every day is switch your TV on, switch your radio on, open up your newspapers. And what we're getting is what would have been described as in the past freak occurrences. So drought, fires are the latest thing. What did we have last month? It wasn't just the hottest month. We had the hottest day. Is it July the 6th, July the 7th? Can't remember. But when we go down and look at the oceans, the RSC, see the Atlantic around Ireland, again, huge increases compared with previous records. Meanwhile, although it's a universally recognized fact, what do we have in terms of at least British politics? Well, we do have Tory MPs, which are more on the sort of freaky wing of the Tory party, aren't we? Talking about, well, it's summer, shrug of shoulders. But what we have in terms of politics, in terms of approaching the next general election, is a Tory party that wants to play, to use a phrase, the anti-green card. And if you look at the most recent by-election in Richmond, what do we have? We have a Tory party concentrating their fire on the ULEZ, ultra-low emission zone in London. Clearly, that's part of a bigger package as far as the Tories are concerned. And how has Labour under Keir Starmer responded? Well, he responded, didn't he, by attacking Sadiq Khan and going too fast. He responded on the basis of looking at the books and not upsetting the city and interest rates and all the rest of it by retreating from his very modest so-called Green New Deal. We're copying Joe Biden, to saying, well, if we can't afford it, and we can't because of the Tories, then we ain't going to do it until the very, well, you can believe that or you can believe anything, but it's clearly the case if you take the Labour Party, what it's doing, to use a phrase, is greenwashing its political programme. It hasn't got, of course, what a surprise, the most right-wing Labour government in waiting. It clearly hasn't got a programme to radically reorganise the economy, radically reorganise the way that we live. It's going to be carrying on, doing what we've all done, but with a bit of rhetoric and quite frankly, some minor expenditure. So we have this sort of huge paradox in front of us. Here we are, we're not only in danger of hitting 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, we're in danger that will become the new norm, as we go towards the 2030s, and no prospect at all, at least that I can see, in terms of any serious projection, that line of travel will come to an end. My understanding is that in terms of where we are now, you'd almost have to shut off all CO2 emissions, which, in terms of the balance now, right, in order to meet their long-term 2050 targets, for example, which is clearly impossible. It cannot happen. It will not happen. So in terms of 2050, we're looking at not 1.5 degrees, we're looking at more at 2 and 2+, and then we carry on. What the limit is, I haven't got a clue, but that's clearly where we're at now. And far from cutting emissions, what we see is a minor, how should I put it, flattening out. We don't see any sudden sharp cut. We actually see a continued growth of emissions. Okay, so under these circumstances, what is happening? Well, in most of the Western world, we have various protest campaigns, but I'll stick to Britain because I don't think it's exceptional. I don't think that there's anything radically different about Britain compared with the United States, Canada, Germany, France, or wherever. What we have is concentration on minoritarian actions. I think that is perfectly understandable. And I'm going to be the absolute last person to say that these actions should be opposed or condemned. But clearly, and I would very much suspect that this is the case, and certainly having spoken to people, if you take people taking part in such actions, like marching down the street, going very slowly and buggering up the traffic, going along to Lord's cricket ground and tearing up some orange programme or wherever they got the paper from and scattering it about, going up to Sheffield to the snooker and letting off a load of, is it turmeric or something like that, whatever the orange powder happens to be, going on. I mean, I was listening to the first night of the proms, inevitably someone in the audience, I had to listen to it on the radio, I wasn't watching it, I don't know what they did. As far as I know, they went to the front and said, just stop oil. What was interesting though, again, I suppose not surprising, is that instead of in the Albert Hall, a ringing declaration of, yes, you're doing the right thing, no to oil, down with the capitalist system, or something along those lines, what you got is predictable. And that's the BBC announcers going, interruption, we get on with the music, Sibelius, and stuff like that, right? But from the audience, a big boo, a big whoa. And it's no surprising, is it? If you block the M25, if you block Marylebone Road or Islington High Street, it's no surprise, especially if you read, and I do, not avidly, but I do read The Sun, I do read the Daily Mail, I do read the Express. I try to have a look at Sky News. Why? Because at least half the population is doing that. Half the population is influenced by that. And so what you get with great deal of publicity and a great deal of approval from these news peddlers is you basically get encouragement to violence, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it, because if you look at the language, what you get is these eco-loonies. What you get is brave mum tackles climate mad people, right? What you've got at the moment, these cameras around London, monitoring cars and taking pictures of their number plates, and it's going to be in operation, isn't it, at the end of this month? So the ULEZ scheme comes in at the end of this month. And what's been going on in London is people have been climbing up ladders, snipping the wires, taking the cameras. But in my view, although you get from the sun, you basically get, these are the good guys. These people are to be approved of, and Sadiq Khan is a mad person, inconveniencing people, causing unnecessary expense to people. Now we can get into the argument, and I'm readily, willing to have the argument. I am not an enthusiast for, how should you put it, taxing the poor, taxing people like me. And when I've lived in London most of my life. When Ken Livingstone, for example, introduced the central London travel zone, where you had to pay, what was it, £8, now it's 12, whatever it was, at least, right? And that made a huge difference to me. I don't know what the statistic was, but I think it's like doubling the number of buses, right? Right. And for someone like me, that made a huge difference. And he introduced bus lanes, right? He couldn't, extend the underground like that because it takes bloody ages to dig tunnels and put that sort of infrastructure in. But nonetheless, what we had is cheap travel, much speedier travel, and a lot more of it. So, for example, I live in central London, and if a bus goes by, I just sort of shrug my shoulders, and I don't even need to look at the panel that they sometimes have. The next bus will be in 2 minutes, precisely because the next bus that I can get will be in something like 2 minutes. I know, looking at my old Conrad, I don't mean old, by the way, in that sense, but we used to live in a place called Hemel Hempstead. This is a car town, one of those post-World War II, built for the car. They did have things called buses, but if I missed a bus, I would be cursing, because the next one that will be due will be half an hour. Will it turn up? We used to live in a place called Castlebury Farm, right, which was in Baker's End, which was in Wareside, which is next to Ware, right? I used to work in Ware, right? Get a bus. They had buses. There were 2 buses a day. And quite frankly, I got to and from work, the generosity of people. I used to thumb my way in, right? Anyway, all I'm really trying to say is that if you live in outer London, if you live anywhere in London, you need transport. And what hasn't happened with Sadiq Khan, as far as I know, is a revolution in transport. Either way, the point I'm making, though, I think is more fundamental, and that's the sort of nature of the political debate. Because the nature of the political debate is the Tories, of all people, and I know, votes count, but the Tories speaking in the name of class war. And it reminds me again, talking about the same sort of news sources, the Sun, the Mail, reporting doctors' strikes, not least the doctors' strikes by consultants. And the image that we got from these sources is these are greedy bastards. They're on 160,000 or whatever it happens to be. And that is the image that we have of, Sadiq Khan's mad sort of ultra low emission zone. At the same time, and what isn't being fought around, is the fact that we've had, I think it's the first time, remember the young girl who had on her death certificate, death by car pollution, right? It's the first time, and they had to campaign for that. But we had that coroner's, I think it was a deputy coroner came out with that result. I know, right, in terms of people I know in London, people with asthma, which is extremely common, more and more common. And what we don't have is the campaign for clean air. We don't have that. Now, again, we had a headline and a good article in the Weekly Worker. We compared the absence of clean air in London today, you can't see it in the same way you did in the 50s or the 40s with smoke, something I remember well, right? Because that was visible, you could sort of articulate it in a way, but the present pollution is invisible. And I mean, unless you've got sophisticated monitors or whatever. I mean, to me, it's not fundamentally different to the campaign to actually be able to drink clean water. Why the hell should Londoners and other urban dwellers actually breathe in every single day air that actually leads to premature death, bad health, and all sorts of other negative results? But what I'm really trying to point to anyway is where the political debate is at the moment in Britain. So on the one hand, we have minoritarian protests that are greeted, at least by the right, with overt hostility, and increasingly by the Labour Party with overt hostility. And the reality of day-to-day pollution in a city like London, and an impending global climate crisis. It's like, we're all marching towards the edge of a cliff. And instead of actually saying stop, instead of saying let's do something about this, we're allowing ourselves to be led by people who clearly are aiming, not in any conscious, nasty sense, but because of their own obsessions, their own drives, are taking us towards the cliff. And so therefore what I wanted to move on to is, what is that drive? Either they're crazy or there's something else. And of course it is a something else, and it can be summed up very neatly. Meeting in progress, yeah. It can be summed up very neatly by the famous formula from capital MCM plus. I've called it, from the Bible, the mark of the devil, 666. This is what is driving. This is what is taking us in that direction. And in terms of the socialist movement, I think the socialist movement has a problem here. I mean, some of them, damn it, look to China. We've been talking about that this morning as some sort of alternative. So Robert Griffiths, apparently, I did read just the beginning of his damned article. I would just be so deeply embarrassed writing something like that. No, seriously, wouldn't you? I was in China and we were taken to a sumptuous party education school, and everything else in the article will be glowing with praise. Everything, in China's wonderful, going forward. Nothing in terms of this imperative. What is moving China forward? Is it the good of the Chinese people? You could certainly say it's for the good of the Chinese state. But what's the other imperative that moves China today? We have wage labor in China. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Not on the fringes, not, in between the gaps. That's how the system works. And we also have capital accumulation. And that's why, at least I would argue, however one characterizes China, I wouldn't actually say it's just a capitalist society, sit down and think I've solved anything. But clearly there's capitalism in it. And there's a distinct possibility, not only that system becomes complete, right? But also, of course, if that is the case, China is impelled to become imperialist, isn't it? The system works like that. It's a pyramid, and those at the top suck surplus value from those below. And if you're not at the top, then surplus value is sucked from you. You're either a robber or you're robbed, right? So the idea that China is somehow outside that particular conundrum is not convincing. And of course, what's been happening, as was predictable, unfortunately, having backed the Soviet Union and seen the Soviet Union crash down humiliatingly, without hardly a shot being fired in anger. I know there was the, whatever the hell they called it, military coup that lasted X days. I know that the people in Romania, you know, were shot down. But in general, what happened is that there wasn't any violence. And most noticeably, it was those below that were pushing on the overthrow of the system. So instead of these people learning anything from that, they seem determined, having put the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe behind them, they seem determined to go on and bless China, capitalist China or semi-capitalist China, call it what you will. And not only do you have those people doing it, i.e. people like Andrew Murray, Ben Chacko, Robert Griffiths, we've already mentioned. You have your old comrades, Mike. I'm not saying all of them, but John Ross, right? Yeah, John Ross. Apparently, John Ross has just received China's highest book accolade. And he keeps writing articles on the Socialist Action site about it. And one article I read, he was saying, well, he works in China, by the way. Right, one article is saying, if I could, I would join the Chinese Communist Party, right? But of course, he's not a native. So apparently, I don't know the rules of the Chinese Communist Party, but he's not allowed to. But he keeps boasting about this book, right? Which, of course, is merely an apologia for the Chinese regime, because he believes it in the same way that one might have believed, you know, Khrushchev's Road to Communism, that by 90, he wrote this, I think it wasn't it in the early 60s, if I remember, 61, presenting it to the 22nd Congress, whatever. Anyway, and they committed in that program that by 1970, the Soviet Union would catch up with the United States. By 1980, remember 1980, they would have communism. And this is what it reminds me of. And what we have, you know, is a growing, how should I put it, pro-China left. Now, if I was in the third world, so-called, I can sort of understand that at some level, right? At some level. But we're not dealing with people in the third world. We're dealing with people in Britain. We're dealing with the left in Britain. Now, of course, this is a minority. I'm not suggesting anything else. But what I am talking about, I suppose, is what way forward. And if it isn't the Chinese model that is presented as the way forward, what we get is a left. It's basically tailist, and that's really what I'm trying to get at. We have a left that actually, in the form, for example, of the Socialist Workers' Party, that looks at these minoritarian actions that I've described, and they're actually not presenting an alternative to these people. They're trying to recruit them. And they're trying to recruit them as they are. Okay, they then become sellers of socialist work and attenders and clappers at the annual Marxism festival. But I mean, for the best of me, I read Socialist Worker every week. I read their articles on climate and climate protests. I get nothing in the way of advice. And indeed, what we had, remember XR when it was hitting headlines? They loved that. But when XR said, they actually did issue a statement, of course, got lots of publicity, we give up, or something equivalent. Of course, they hadn't. But what they did is go from minoritarian actions of the sort that we saw with Just Say No to Oil, with Insulate Britain, back to the streets, back to mass action. And Socialist Worker, believe it or not, which is a worshipper of strikes and the street, were decrying that and saying this isn't the right way to go. You need disruption. You need what they called militant action. So tailism. And so having tailed XR at the beginning, they are now tailing the breakaways from XR. And the problem I have with that is sort of, if I was going to draw an analogy, sort of understand the individual activists. It will be like, again, imagining it. Here we are in Russia, say in the 1870s. You say, you know, you look at Europe and you say the working class. Well, there's no working class in Russia, so we can't go to them. The peasants, we've tried the peasants and they tell us to piss off, right? So what do? There's the Tsar, right? You've had good Tsars, bad Tsars, whatever. Okay, you know the story already. What you do is you have a pot at the Tsar. That's militant action, right? And if you don't get the Tsar, maybe you can get a Tsarist minister. And okay, you know, comrades might sort of say, well, you're exaggerating. I don't think I am that much because I haven't watched it yet, but I have read the reviews. I did send one of our comrades the sort of link to watch it. I'm of course thinking of how to blow up a pipeline. And I know in the film, as I understand from the film, the guys who are going to blow up the pipeline, looking at the book, and I think they say something along the lines of, fuck me, it hasn't got any instructions on how you actually blow the damn pipeline up. But precisely what is it? What's his name? I've got it written down. Who's the author? That's the one. Thank you. What he's actually advocating, of course, isn't just the blowing up of an individual pipeline. It's a wider agenda, and it's basically an agenda that justifies violence. Well, I've got no moral objection to violence, unlike if you take XR, which is based on, again, I can't remember her name, but this idiot, that's the one I'm thinking of. Some sort of, she got the Huntington Prize for original thinking on this one. And it's sort of based on Gandhi. It's sort of based on South Africa or American civil rights movement and all the rest of it. But it's the idea that if you get X% of the population committed, and it's a tiny percentage, then you can trigger carry through system change. I think it's clearly nonsense. But the point would still be there because it's nonsense. What it has the danger of is if you're mass action taking over, I don't know, Oxford Circus doesn't work. If your slow march up Oxford Street doesn't work. If you're, you know, occupying the flyover or the bridges or whatever it is on the M25 doesn't work. If custard pieing the Tussauds statue of what was the Prince of Wales, who's now our glorious king, if custard pieing his face doesn't work, well, why not go one step further and get rid of them? Why just stop at attacking a pipeline? Why not attack the executives? Why stop at wax statue when the real thing walks and lives and breathes? Why stop, when it comes to protesting outside Downing Street and take out the person who lives in Downing Street? I mean, logically, that must be the case. And I'm not accusing anyone of it, but, we've had enough experience, in Britain, going back to, I don't know, Mike will tell us the precise date, but, agent provocateurs being sent in to the radical movement. I'm talking about pre-Chartism. You can go back to the time of the French Revolution and, basically, sending in agent provocateurs, getting all these guys arrested and tough sentences. And we are talking also about recent times. I was reading Asa Winstanley talking about an old friend of his who suddenly appeared in the news because he's a spy cop. And Asa describes a situation years back, how they used to do Palestine work. And what we know now is Lindsay German, was spy copped. You lot in the IMG, Mike, they were sitting there in your conferences. okay, that we know that the policeman putting down the notes didn't know what the hell they're talking about. You know, in London, I used to take tourists around on a Lenin walk, and there you are. There used to be a pub in Islington called the Crown and Woolpack. Doesn't exist anymore. That's where the Bolsheviks had one of their London conferences. They had a policeman under the stage with a bucket to relieve himself. At least my story of the Bolshevik conferences, the policeman comes out, reports to his superiors, and says they were talking Russian. Didn't understand a word of Russian. But my main point is that not only did the spy cops spy, right, they also acted as agent provocateurs. They not only left children behind, they wrecked organizations. They wrecked them deliberately. And as I understand it, the latest inquiry had nothing to do, for example, with the Communist Party. And my understanding of the Communist Party, since it was founded in 1920, that a special department of the Secret Service devoted to it, to the point 16 St. John Street, which actually was 27 Bedford Street. That was the old historic headquarters of the CPGB in Covent Garden. It was the first building, as I understand it, to have bulletproof glass on the outside for 2 stories because someone took a machine gun to it. More importantly, when they redeveloped the building, I think it was taken over by Lloyd's Bank or something like that, if you go there. On the, you know, here's the meeting place where the Central Committee meets, and there's the podium, wooden, and behind it there was, yes, a big old-fashioned microphone. But anyway, the point I'm making really isn't the spying, it's the provocation and getting round back to the story. To me, right, if you look at the actions, the minoritarian actions of XR, Just Say No to Oil and all the rest of it, at least in my imagination, I could persuade myself that at least some of these actions have been inspired by MI5, that they're actually doing these actions to defeat that movement. Now, I'm not saying it is, because I think people are naive enough and sincere enough not to need that. And it's like looking at the assassination of various Tsarist officials. You don't need a police agent to carry out an assassination of a Tsar or a Tsarist official. But we do know, right, historic fact, that the heads, while the head of the Bolshevik parliamentary Duma faction was a police spy, we do know that the head of the Socialist Revolutionary Armed Wing was also a police spy. So I don't think I'm sort of fantasizing, but the main point is not that this is the explanation, but it could be. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the job of the left is precisely to know these things. The job of the left is to provide a strategy, not simply encourage people along the road in terms of spontaneous protest, but to direct that protest. And it reminds me in that sense, if you look back at Lenin's writings, it's got this thing, hasn't he, which a lot of people on the left find uncomfortable, overcoming spontaneity, that we've got to bring consciousness to the movement. You don't just follow spontaneity. It's not that you denounce it, right? If there's a strike, you don't sort of stand outside there and, you know, say, this is appalling because you shouldn't be going on strike against the employer. What you need to be doing is overthrowing Tsarism. Nonetheless, your job as a social democrat is precisely to guide that movement, to organize that movement, so it does become a movement to overthrow Tsarism and go beyond. And that's my criticism of not only of the SWP, but most of the left. Most of the left is content with simply trailing behind either minoritarian protest or trailing behind the Green Party. And so what you see, for example, if you look at the various statements of the left, really what we have is a considerable degree of theft from green thinkers. Now, some green thinkers have thought some very useful things. I'm thinking of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, stuff like that. You know, I know you can criticize him, and I certainly would. You know, George Monbiot, when I read George Monbiot, 9 times out of 10, I'm going, really good stuff. Problem, of course, with George, just as an aside, he's got this pathological aversion to Marxism, which must have been beaten into him at whatever damn public school he went to. You know, the idea of organizing the proletariat, organizing the class struggle. No, instead, if you actually read, I'm not saying it's his latest book, but his answer book was to organize a world parliament, right? And it would be X million people elected. But this is going to be voluntary. And the resolutions it passes are going to have moral force. You can imagine the Chinese Communist Party or Xi, or for that matter, Biden or Rishi Sunak going, that's a jolly good. I mean, but so what? So you've still got the corporations. I mean, you've still got capitalism running, George. What are you going to do? And clearly he hasn't got any answers. And so that, to me, is the job of the left. And this is where we're at, isn't it? Because what the left seems to have retreated to is the worship of the street and the strikes. And so, yeah, socialist worker, while trailing behind minoritarian actions, is saying what needs to happen is that somehow Just Say No to Oil needs to be merged with strikes. The problem with strikes, I'm not saying, yeah, the problem with strikes is precisely the limitation of strikes. Strikes tend to be sectional. And the danger of sectional strikes is one section of the working class can end up against another section of the working class. Clearly, it's limited. Clearly, it's limited not only to the capitalist system, it's limited to the lowest level of politics. And out of that lowest level of politics does not come higher politics, at least according to Lenin, what is to be done, Karl Kautsky, classic Marxism. You need a program, you need a theory, which doesn't come out of the day-to-day struggle of the working class. It comes out of the study of history, comes out of a much wider vision. Okay, I'm going to come to an end in about 2-3 minutes. I don't know how long I've spoken for, but I'm sure enough. 40, that's fine, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so what is to be done? I'm going to sound very boring. I think there is one major answer to what needs to be done. And Lenin had I don't know what it was with Lenin and chains. I don't think he had a fetish about chains, but it's one of these metaphors that Lenin keeps using again and again, weak link of imperialism. But also he had this chain metaphor of grasping the main link, grasping the main contradiction. So there are many, many things that need to be done. But what you need to do is find the fundamental thing and hold that, put that together and keep that together until you've solved it. And my answer to that is the party question, that unless the left can organize in a serious party that has the chance of organizing millions, that has a serious chance and perspective, not only of doing that for the reasons that Mike was talking, but of necessity doing it on a planetary basis. You know, what do Tory politicians say? Oh, we can't do anything. We only account for 1% of global emissions. So you might as well do nothing. That's really the answer they're giving. Well, we need to take that on board. What can we do in Britain? Mike, you were talking about food imports. You know, how long? I mean, I was debating with the comrades in Scotland, Scottish Socialist Party. Apparently, if you declare Scottish socialism, because it's got long, remember, you know, Tommy Sheridan and Alan, what's his name? McCombs, wasn't it? McCombs, I just about remember. Nice guy. Anyway, the point would be Scotland's got a long coastline. Scotland's got lots of water. Scotland's got talented people, and it could be a paradise. Well, yeah, if it wasn't for the British government, presumably down south, or the United Kingdom, or the disunited Kingdom, you know what I mean, the rest of the United Kingdom, it would do very fine, unless they decided to blockade the lovely Scottish coastline, unless they decided to send the British Army up there, or get the Scottish regiments who are born, you know, not born, who are sworn to loyalty to the monarch, and get them to, you know, come on, guys. Does Scotland feed itself? I don't know. Either way, if they want to eat just stuff that is grown in Scotland, if they want to consume things that are just, you know, built in Scotland, what we're actually talking about is an extreme version of poverty. That's true for Britain. And I would argue that, you know, even if we have European ambitions, we're dealing with a world economy. All you can say with Europe is because it represents an advanced part of the world, it is a part of the world that other working classes could look to for help, look to for inspiration, look to somewhere that isn't automatically going to be doomed to poverty on an almost instant basis. So the problem, of course, we've got is precisely the huge gap between looking at this room, however splendid you are and inspiring you all are. Here we are, and the task is it just organising in Britain and overcoming our friends in the Socialist Workers' Party and our friends in the Morning Star who are determined to worship, you know, at the shrine of Conrad Z, or whatever, you know, daft idea the left has this week. So thinking about socialist appeal, Chavismo. The week before that, it was the Scottish Socialist Party. The week before, I'm exaggerating only slightly, the week before that, it was Clause 4, Socialism and the Labour Party that were going to do it. No, we need something way beyond that. So yeah, to me, not the answer, but the beginning of an answer, the beginning of a serious answer is the fight for a Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party, right, isn't an answer in itself. It has to be equipped with a program when it comes to the global climate crisis that is adequate to our task. So that's only the first step. And I'm not going to, Emil, I did promise Emil that I would be engaging in a polemic with him, but as he's on a train at the moment, I will resist it. But the point I'm making is, yes, we do need a program to meet the climate emergency. And I think in terms of our draft program, however inadequate you know, the draft is, I think it does represent a good first step in that direction in terms of intent. It is something that you could win, not just the left, but millions of people to, and I'll finish there.